The street was quiet, the kind of calm that often comes before something unexpected. Justice Nathaniel Carter walked alone, his simple clothes blending him into the surroundings. But as the glow of police headlights illuminated his path, he knew the night was about to change. The officers didn't see a man who had spent his life upholding the law. They saw someone who didn't belong. Have you ever wondered what justice looks like when the one who upholds the law becomes a victim of the very system they serve? Nathaniel had spent years defending justice from the bench, but tonight, justice was slipping through his fingers. As the officers approached, he made a decision. He would say nothing, not because he was powerless, but because he wanted to feel the full weight of a broken system, one that saw his skin before his dignity. Little did they know, their assumptions would cost them everything, and Nathaniel would be the one to reveal the truth in a way they never saw coming. The evening air was crisp, carrying with it a sense of tranquility that Justice Nathaniel Carter rarely experienced. As a Black Supreme Court justice, his life was often filled with meetings, intense cases, and the pressure of being one of the few African Americans at such a high level of the judiciary. But tonight, in his simple attire, walking through the quiet streets of a modest neighborhood, Nathaniel felt almost invisible. He wanted it that way, just for one night, to be another face in the crowd, free from the weight of his title. Nathaniel had long been aware of the reality of racial profiling. As a judge, he had presided over countless cases where Black men were stopped, searched, and sometimes arrested for no reason other than the color of their skin. Though he had fought against this injustice from behind the bench, tonight he had decided to confront it directly. If the system was so broken, he would experience it firsthand. The headlights of a police car reflected off the storefront windows, the hum of the engine low but unmistakable. Nathaniel didn't flinch as the car slowed beside him. Two white officers, their faces shadowed under their caps, watched him closely. He could feel their suspicion radiating through the glass before they even said a word. "Hey, you!" one of them called out. "Hold up a second!" Nathaniel's heart didn't race, though the tension was unmistakable. He turned slowly to face them, his expression calm, his hands visible. He already knew what was about to happen. He could stop it before it escalated, pull out his badge, reveal who he was. But that wasn't the plan. Tonight, he wasn't Justice Nathaniel Carter. Tonight, he was just another Black man on the street. The officer who had called out James Muldoon stepped out of the car, his gaze sharp and untrusting. Behind him, his partner Alex Grayson followed more cautiously, though there was an air of unease about him. Muldoon's eyes scanned Nathaniel from head to toe, his lips curving into a tight, judgmental line. "Where are you coming from?" Muldoon asked, his voice carrying that all-too-familiar tone of authority mixed with disdain. Nathaniel met his gaze but said nothing. He didn't need to answer, and more importantly, he wouldn't. This was the moment he had anticipated. He wanted to see what would happen when he offered no resistance, but also no compliance. It was a subtle defiance, a choice to let the officers dictate the next move. "I asked you a question," Muldoon repeated, stepping closer, his hand already resting on the baton at his side. Grayson remained behind, watching but not interfering. His eyes flickered with doubt, but he was too used to following Muldoon's lead to step in. Nathaniel could sense the dynamics between the two. Muldoon, the dominant force, eager to assert control, and Grayson, hesitant, yet complicit in his silence. When Nathaniel didn't respond, Muldoon's face darkened with irritation. "I said, 'Where are you coming from?'" He was louder now, trying to provoke a reaction. Nathaniel continued to stand there, silent. He could feel the weight of Muldoon's assumption pressing down on him. Assumptions built on the color of his skin, the neighborhood he was walking through, the fact that he wasn't immediately bowing to the officer's authority. "Let me guess," Muldoon sneered, stepping even closer, his breath hot with aggression. "You think you're too good to talk to me? Is that it?" Nathaniel remained calm, his mind focused not on the immediate moment, but on the bigger picture. He knew what was coming next. The game had been set, and Muldoon was already playing his part. Grayson shifted uneasily but said nothing. His silence was damning, Yet it was clear he was questioning the situation. Nathaniel could see it in his eyes. But it wasn't enough to stop what was about to unfold. Without warning, Muldoon grabbed Nathaniel's arm, twisting it behind his back. The sudden movement was rough and unnecessary, but Nathaniel didn't resist. He allowed it to happen, his eyes focused straight ahead, his mind detached from the physical pain. The cold metal of the handcuffs clamped down on his wrists, and Muldoon shoved him toward the squad car. "You're under arrest," Muldoon snapped, his voice dripping with smug satisfaction. Nathaniel allowed himself to be led to the car, the weight of the cuffs a reminder of the prejudice that still gripped the country. He glanced over at Grayson, who met his eyes for a fleeting moment, a flicker of guilt crossing his face before he looked away. Muldoon pushed Nathaniel into the back seat of the car and slammed the door shut. As the car began to move, the officer's arrogance was palpable. He believed he had won. He had asserted his control over another powerless black man. But Nathaniel knew better. This was only the beginning. Inside the squad car, Nathaniel's thoughts shifted to the future. He could already picture the courtroom, the astonished faces of Muldoon and Grayson when they realized who he truly was. He imagined the moment he would stand up in front of the judge and reveal his identity, the ripple of shock that would follow. They had no idea the man they had just arrested was a Supreme Court justice. Muldoon glanced in the rearview mirror, his eyes catching Nathaniel's in the reflection. "Bet you weren't expecting this tonight, huh?" he mocked. Nathaniel's lips curved into the faintest smile, but he didn't respond. Let them have their moment of triumph. He could afford to be patient. In the end, it would be Muldoon and Grayson who would face the consequences, not him. As they arrived at the police station, Nathaniel stepped out of the car, maintaining his silence. He was led through the process like any other suspect. Photographed, fingerprinted, stripped of his dignity in the eyes of those who didn't know the truth. Muldoon couldn't hide his smirk as he watched, convinced of his superiority. Grayson, on the other hand, was growing more uneasy by the second. The doubt in his eyes had deepened into something more. Fear, perhaps, or the slow realization that this arrest might not be as straightforward as it seemed. "Put him in holding," Muldoon ordered, handing Nathaniel off to another officer. "He can spend the night in a cell." As Nathaniel was led away, he remained silent, his mind focused on the upcoming trial. He could almost hear the gavel striking the bench, the gasps of the courtroom, the moment when the truth would finally come to light. Tonight, he would endure this indignity, but tomorrow, the balance of power would shift. He was not just another black man on the street. He was Justice Nathaniel Carter, and soon the entire world would know it. The cold, damp air of the holding cell clung to Nathaniel as he sat on the thin metal bench, his hands resting on his knees. The cell was small, barely more than a cage, but Nathaniel didn't need much space to think. He had been in far more uncomfortable situations in his career, both in and out of the courtroom, but this was different. This was personal. As he sat there, silent and composed, Nathaniel's mind raced over the details of the night's events. He could still feel the sharp pressure of the handcuffs, the condescending tone in Officer Muldoon's voice, and the flicker of doubt in Officer Grayson's eyes. It was all playing out as he had anticipated, but now the real test would begin. He had spent a lifetime preparing for moments like this, moments where patience, control, and calculated timing could change everything. Nathaniel glanced up when he heard footsteps approaching. It was Muldoon, of course, with that same smug expression plastered on his face, carrying the weight of a man who thought he had already won. Grayson trailed behind him, his eyes darting nervously between Nathaniel and his partner. The power dynamic between them was clear. Muldoon thrived on dominance, and Grayson, though less certain, followed his lead. Muldoon leaned against the bars of the cell, crossing his arms. "Not so talkative now, huh? You got a real quiet night ahead of you." Nathaniel said nothing, his eyes locking on Muldoon's. The silence wasn't out of fear or submission. It was deliberate, a choice to let Muldoon and Grayson dig their own graves deeper. Every word they uttered, every action they took, would soon be laid bare in court, and Nathaniel was in no hurry to rush the process. "You know, I was thinking," Muldoon continued, his voice oozing arrogance. "Guys like you, always thinking you're above the law. But we showed you tonight, didn't we?" Nathaniel's calm gaze remained steady, the weight of Muldoon's words slipping off him like water. He didn't need to respond. Everything would change soon enough. Grayson cleared his throat, trying to muster some semblance of professionalism. Maybe we should check the paperwork, Muldoon. Make sure everything's, squared away." "Ah!" Muldoon shot Grayson a look of irritation. "Paperwork's fine. We don't need to check anything." But Grayson's suggestion had clearly unsettled him, even if just slightly. Nathaniel watched the exchange, noting how Grayson's discomfort was growing. It wouldn't take much for the younger officer to crack under pressure. Muldoon, on the other hand, was still riding the wave of his supposed victory. He truly believed he had arrested a nobody, another faceless black man whose rights were secondary to his authority. Muldoon pushed himself off the bars and smirked. "Enjoy your night," he said with a final glance at Nathaniel, then motioned for Grayson to follow him out. As the footsteps faded, Nathaniel leaned back against the cold concrete wall. His body was stiff from the rough treatment, but his mind was sharper than ever. He had to admit, there was a grim satisfaction in watching Muldoon's confidence, knowing that soon it would crumble into pieces. The arrogance, the racial prejudice, the abuse of power, it would all come crashing down. Hours passed, but sleep never came. Nathaniel's thoughts were consumed by the upcoming court appearance. He knew that Laura, his trusted assistant, was already working behind the scenes. She had been with him for years and knew exactly what to do. By now, his legal team would be preparing their case, and soon the world would learn of the gross injustice that had been committed. But for now he would wait. His silence was a weapon more powerful than any words he could utter in the moment. The next morning came with the sound of the cell door opening. A guard motioned for Nathaniel to step out. It was time. He was led through the police station, where Muldoon and Grayson were waiting. Muldoon still had that irritating smirk on his face, but there was an edge to it now, a subtle anxiety that Nathaniel could sense. The courtroom would be their battleground, and Muldoon was confident that his badge would shield him from whatever came next. Nathaniel, however, knew better. "Let's get this over with," Muldoon muttered, as he and Grayson escorted Nathaniel out to the patrol car, handcuffs once again locking around his wrists. The ride to the courthouse was tense, the silence thick in the air. Muldoon occasionally glanced back at Nathaniel through the rearview mirror, but Nathaniel kept his gaze forward, his expression unreadable. Grayson didn't say a word, clearly rattled by the looming trial. As they pulled up to the courthouse, a small crowd of onlookers had gathered. The media was there too, drawn in by whispers of an unusual arrest. Nathaniel knew that once the trial began, this small crowd would turn into a national spectacle. Muldoon yanked Nathaniel out of the car and led him through the throng of people, most of whom were unaware of his true identity. To them, he was just another defendant, a man standing trial for who knows what. Nathaniel had deliberately kept a low profile, and that anonymity was now working to his advantage. Inside the courthouse, Nathaniel was placed in a holding room to wait. The clock ticked, but he remained calm, knowing his moment was fast approaching. A sharp knock on the door broke the silence, and Nathaniel looked up to see Alicia Thompson, a young public defender assigned to him for the day. She entered the room with a harried expression, her briefcase clutched tightly in her hand. "Mr. Carter," she began, fumbling through her notes. "I'm Alicia Thompson. I'll be representing you today." Nathaniel gave her a small, reassuring nod. "I appreciate that, Ms. Thompson." She blinked, her eyes flicking up to meet his. Something in his tone, calm, controlled, far too composed for a man facing charges, seemed to catch her off guard. She looked down at her notes again, clearly confused. I'm still going through the details, but I have to say, you seem very relaxed for someone in your situation," she said cautiously. Nathaniel's lips curved into a slight smile. "Let's just say I'm confident things will work out in the end." Alicia stared at him for a moment, her brow furrowing as she tried to make sense of his words. There was something about this man that didn't add up, and it was clear that she was starting to suspect that there was more to his story than what the police report had suggested. Before she could press further, the door opened, and an officer stepped in to escort them to the courtroom. Alicia gathered her things, casting one last curious glance at Nathaniel before following the officer out. The courtroom was packed with people, most of whom were still oblivious to who Nathaniel truly was. Muldoon and Grayson sat confidently at the prosecution's table, exchanging smug looks as the trial began. The judge, Amanda Whitaker, called the room to order, her gavel striking the bench with a sharp crack. Nathaniel was seated at the defense table beside Alicia, who was still scanning her notes, unaware that she was about to be part of one of the most pivotal cases of her career. The prosecution began with Muldoon and Grayson painting a picture of a defiant suspect who had refused to comply with lawful orders. Nathaniel listened without flinching as they twisted the truth, framing their actions as necessary and justified. Alicia looked increasingly uncomfortable as the officers testified, clearly sensing that something was off. She glanced at Nathaniel, who remained calm, his eyes focused on the judge. When it was the defense's turn, Alicia stood to address the court. She was inexperienced but passionate, and she began poking holes in the officer's testimony. The more she pressed, the more Muldoon's cockiness wavered. Grayson, on the other hand, looked as though he might crumble under the pressure. But the real moment of truth had yet to come. Nathaniel could feel the tension building as the trial progressed, the weight of the courtroom's gaze shifting toward him. The judge looked over at him, curiosity in her eyes. Who was this man, sitting so calmly at the defense table, seemingly unshaken by the accusations against him? Then Alicia stepped aside, allowing Nathaniel to stand and speak for himself. The courtroom fell silent as he rose to his feet, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. With a calm, measured voice, Nathaniel began to recount the events of that night. Not with anger, but with the precision of a man who knew the law inside and out. His words were deliberate, and every eye in the courtroom was fixed on him as he laid out the truth. Then came the moment that would change everything. "My name," Nathaniel said, his voice steady, "is Justice Nathaniel Carter. I am a Supreme Court Justice of the United States." Gasps erupted in the courtroom as the weight of his words hit. Muldoon's face went pale, and Grayson looked as though the ground had just fallen out from beneath him. The judge stared at Nathaniel in shock, struggling to process what she had just heard. And in that instant, the entire course of the trial shifted. The revelation of Nathaniel Carter's true identity hit the courtroom like a tidal wave, crashing through the assumptions and arrogance of everyone present. The gasps of disbelief hung in the air, and for a moment it seemed like time itself had stopped. The silence was deafening. Officer James Muldoon froze, his smirk vanishing in an instant. The color drained from his face as he stared at Nathaniel, his brain struggling to catch up with the reality of the situation. Officer Alex Grayson shifted uncomfortably, his earlier discomfort now blossoming into full-fledged panic. He cast a sideways glance at Muldoon, who was gripping the edge of the prosecution table with white knuckles. Judge Amanda Whitaker blinked, her eyes widening as she absorbed Nathaniel's words. The courtroom, which had moments ago seemed so routine, had transformed into a stage for a shocking drama that none had anticipated. I beg your pardon?" Judge Whitaker stammered, leaning forward as though she hadn't heard him correctly. Nathaniel remained calm, his voice steady as he repeated himself, louder this time for the entire courtroom to hear. "I am Justice Nathaniel Carter, one of the sitting justices on the Supreme Court of the United States." A ripple of murmurs swept through the gallery, the spectators now buzzing with astonishment. The court officers exchanged frantic glances, and the reporters, sensing the gravity of the moment, began furiously scribbling notes. This was no ordinary trial. This was about to become front-page news. For a brief moment, Muldoon seemed to recover, straightening up as if to brush off the shocking turn of events. "What does it matter who you are?" he spat, but his voice lacked the conviction it had held earlier. "You resisted arrest, and that's what this trial is about." Nathaniel turned to him, his calm gaze piercing through the officer's bravado. "Officer Muldoon, this trial is about much more than that," Nathaniel said, his voice smooth but with an edge that cut through the courtroom like a knife. "It's about racial profiling, misconduct, and the abuse of power. You didn't arrest me for any legitimate reason. You arrested me because I'm a black man, walking through a neighborhood you deemed suspicious." Judge Whittaker, finally regaining her composure, banged her gavel to silence the murmurs still rippling through the room. "Order! I will have order in my courtroom." Her voice carried authority, but the shock had not yet left her eyes. Turning to Nathaniel, she nodded slightly. "Justice Carter," she said, her tone now more respectful, "you may continue." Nathaniel stepped forward, his hands resting lightly on the defense table as he addressed the court. "I could have revealed my identity the moment I was stopped. I could have used my position to avoid the treatment that so many others face every day, but I didn't. I remained silent because I wanted to experience firsthand what it feels like to be judged not by the content of my character, but by the color of my skin." The room was so silent that the sound of pens scratching on paper seemed deafening. Muldoon and Grayson sat frozen, trapped in the gravity of their actions, as Nathaniel continued. "What happened that night wasn't just an isolated incident. It's a reflection of a system that is broken, where people in positions of power abuse that power without consequences. I've seen it happen to others time and time again in my courtroom, and I decided that I wouldn't just sit back and rule from the bench. I needed to feel what they feel. And now, everyone here can see how easily justice can be distorted when prejudice takes the wheel." Muldoon, visibly sweating now, attempted to regain control. "That's not true. You didn't answer our questions. You were being evasive. We had cause." Nathaniel didn't flinch. "Cause? Your cause was my skin color. The moment you saw me, you assumed I didn't belong. You assumed I was guilty before I had said a single word. And now, you're trying to justify what you did because you refuse to admit your own bias." The power in Nathaniel's voice sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Muldoon's face was a mask of panic, his mind no doubt racing for an escape, but there was none. David Reynolds, Nathaniel's lead attorney, stood up then, his calm but authoritative presence commanding attention. "Your Honor," Reynolds said, addressing Judge Whittaker, "the defense would like to formally request that all charges against Justice Carter be dismissed immediately on the grounds of unlawful arrest and racial profiling." Judge Whittaker sat back in her chair, clearly grappling with the bombshell that had been dropped on her court. Her face was unreadable as she weighed her options. Finally she nodded, her voice steady but tinged with solemnity. "I agree," she said. "All charges against Justice Carter are hereby dismissed, effective immediately." Muldoon's eyes widened in disbelief. "You can't just—" Judge Whittaker slammed her gavel. "I said, order in the court, Officer Muldoon. You're lucky I'm not holding you in contempt." "What?" The look of absolute defeat on Muldoon's face was unmistakable. His career, his reputation, everything he had built was crumbling right in front of him. Grayson, though quieter, was no less shaken. He had followed Muldoon's lead, and now he too would pay the price. But Nathaniel wasn't finished yet. He took a breath, his voice calm but resolute. "While the charges against me are dismissed, that doesn't mean this ends here. Officers Muldoon and Grayson must be held accountable for their actions. They didn't just make a mistake. They knowingly violated my civil rights and acted on racial prejudice." Judge Whittaker nodded slowly. "Justice Carter, I agree. A formal inquiry will be launched into the conduct of these officers, and if misconduct is found, they will be held accountable to the full extent of the law." Muldoon slumped in his seat, his face ashen. The reality of his downfall was finally sinking in. His arrogance had been replaced with fear. Fear of the consequences he would now face. Grayson looked like he might break down at any moment, the weight of his complicity pressing down on him. After the courtroom adjourned, the aftermath was immediate. Reporters flocked to the courthouse steps, microphones and cameras at the ready. Nathaniel, however, remained composed, walking out with his legal team as the cameras flashed. He hadn't done this for the attention. He had done it to expose the deep-rooted problems in the system, and now that exposure had begun. As Nathaniel stepped outside, Laura, his trusted assistant, was waiting for him. She had known all along what was happening, and her expression was one of quiet pride. "Well," she said softly, walking beside him, "you certainly made an impact." Nathaniel gave her a small smile. It was necessary. The media swarmed, but Nathaniel's calm demeanor never wavered. He stopped briefly to address the crowd of reporters, knowing that the message needed to be heard. "What happened to me is just one example of a much larger problem," Nathaniel said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Too many people, black men and women, are treated like criminals simply because of their appearance. The system that's supposed to protect us often fails us, and that needs to change." He paused, letting the words sink in. "We need to hold those in power accountable. We need to reform how law enforcement operates, how justice is served, and how we as a society view each other. This isn't just about me. This is about justice for everyone." The crowd erupted into applause, a wave of support rippling through the onlookers. Nathaniel's message was clear, and it resonated with the people who had gathered. The trial was over, but the fight for justice had only just begun. Back inside the courthouse, Muldoon sat in stunned silence. His career was over, and he knew it. The weight of what he had done, what he had allowed himself to become, was now pressing down on him with full force. There was no escaping the consequences of his actions. Grayson, quieter but no less guilty, stared at the floor, his hands shaking slightly. He had followed Muldoon blindly, allowed his own fear and ignorance to lead him down a path of complicity. And now he would face the same fate. The inquiry into their conduct would be swift, and the punishment severe. Nathaniel's case had exposed not only their individual wrongdoings, but also the systemic issues that allowed such behavior to thrive unchecked. They weren't the only ones who would face scrutiny. The entire department would be forced to reckon with the culture that had fostered this kind of misconduct. As Nathaniel walked away from the courthouse, his thoughts turned to the future. He had endured the humiliation, the injustice, and the prejudice that so many others experienced every day. But unlike many, he had the power to change things, and he intended to use that power for good. He glanced up at the sky, the sun shining brightly overhead. This trial had been a battle won, but there was still a war to fight, a war for equality, for accountability, for real justice. And Nathaniel Carter, Supreme Court Justice, would be on the front lines. The courtroom buzzed with the echoes of Nathaniel's revelation, and the shockwaves of his words reverberated long after the judge had dismissed the charges. The fallout from this trial was only beginning, but the destruction left in its wake was already clear in the expressions of Officer Muldoon and Officer Grayson as they faced the reality of what they had done. Outside, the media frenzy was already escalating, but inside the courtroom, Nathaniel took a deep breath. The first part of his plan had succeeded, but now came the part he had been preparing for his entire career. Not just exposing injustice, but holding those responsible accountable. This case was no longer about him, it was about dismantling a broken system. After the courtroom had cleared and the weight of silence settled in, Grayson found himself seated in a small interrogation room back at the precinct. His mind was spinning, every moment from the night of the arrest playing on an endless loop. He had been silent through it all, silent as Muldoon had led the way, silent as they wrongfully arrested a man who had done nothing to warrant it. And now, he would pay for that silence. The door creaked open, and Grayson's superior officer, Lieutenant Marcus, entered the room. He sat down across from Grayson, his face lined with disappointment. There was no anger, no rage, just the heavy burden of someone who had seen too much of this type of situation. "Do you have anything to say for yourself, Grayson?" Lieutenant Marcus asked, his voice low but firm. Grayson swallowed hard, his hands shaking slightly. I didn't know who he was," Grayson began, but the words felt hollow as they left his mouth. "I was just following orders. Muldoon was the one who—" "Muldoon this, Muldoon that," Marcus interrupted, his voice sharp now. "You think that absolves you? Do you think following someone else's lead is going to protect you from the consequences of what you did?" Grayson dropped his gaze to the table, the truth settling deep in his gut. He had known what they were doing was wrong from the start. He had felt it in every fiber of his being that night, but instead of speaking up, instead of questioning Muldoon's actions, he had stayed silent. And now that silence was as damning as Muldoon's arrogance. Lieutenant Marcus sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You're going to have to answer for this, Grayson. There's going to be an investigation into you, into Muldoon, into the entire department. And it's not just about this case. This is going to dig deep. Everything you've done, everything Muldoon has done, it's all coming to light."
What?
Grayson felt the weight of those words pressing down on him like a mountain. He wasn't just losing his career, he was losing his integrity, his sense of who he was as a man. He had allowed his fear to guide him, to paralyze him, and now he was facing the consequences of that choice. "I didn't stop it," Grayson whispered, more to himself than to Marcus. "I should have stopped it." Marcus nodded grimly. "Yes, you should have." While Grayson faced the crushing guilt of his inaction, Muldoon sat in a separate room, his arrogance still clinging to him like a defense mechanism, though cracks were beginning to show. He had been at the top for so long, certain that his position, his badge, and his authority were untouchable. But now, in the cold light of reality, he was beginning to realize just how vulnerable he was. Across from him sat Internal Affairs Investigator Daniels, a man with an unforgiving gaze. Daniels had seen countless officers crumble under pressure, and he was ready to see Muldoon do the same. "So," Daniels began, flipping through a thick file, "why don't you tell me, Officer Muldoon, what was going through your mind the night you arrested Justice Nathaniel Carter?" Muldoon bristled at the mention of Nathaniel's name. "I didn't know who he was. He was acting suspicious, refusing to answer questions, resisting arrest. I did my job." Daniels raised an eyebrow, his pen tapping lightly against the table. "Did your job, or did you abuse your power?" Muldoon's jaw tightened. "I didn't abuse anything. That man was deliberately trying to provoke us. He knew what he was doing." "Oh!" Daniels leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. "And what exactly do you think he was doing, Muldoon? Walking while black? Is that the crime you arrested him for?" Muldoon's face reddened. That's exactly what it was," Daniels snapped, cutting him off. "You saw a black man walking in a neighborhood, and you assumed the worst. You didn't ask questions, you didn't follow procedure, and now you're going to pay the price for that." For the first time since the trial, Muldoon's bravado faltered. He stared at Daniels, his mind racing. He had always believed that his badge would protect him, that his actions, no matter how questionable, would be justified in the eyes of the law. But now, that belief was crumbling around him. "There's going to be a full investigation into every arrest you've ever made, every report you've ever filed," Daniels continued, his voice relentless. "And when we find the patterns, because we will find them, you're not just going to lose your job, Muldoon. You're going to lose everything." Muldoon's hands clenched into fists, the reality of his situation crashing down on him. He had built his entire career on a foundation of control, of authority, but now that foundation was cracking, and he was powerless to stop it. While Muldoon and Grayson faced the consequences of their actions, Nathaniel Carter was preparing for the next phase of his plan. The dismissal of his charges had been the first step, but it wasn't enough. He had exposed the corruption within the system, but now he needed to make sure that the system itself was held accountable. Nathaniel sat in his office, surrounded by files and legal documents. His assistant, Laura, stood by his side, her expression serious but determined. "We've already started receiving calls from civil rights organizations across the country," Laura said, handing Nathaniel a list of contacts. "They want to help with the investigation, and they're ready to push for reforms." Nathaniel nodded, scanning the list. "Good. We need to keep the momentum going. This case is going to set a precedent, not just for how police misconduct is handled, but for how we address racial profiling at every level of law enforcement." Laura hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Do you think Muldoon and Grayson will face jail time?" Nathaniel paused, considering the question. "They might, but what matters more than their individual punishment is the broader change we can make. This isn't just about two corrupt officers. It's about a system that allows people like them to operate unchecked. Laura nodded, her respect for Nathaniel deepening. He had never been a man focused on vengeance or personal gain. His goal had always been justice, for everyone, not just himself. As they worked late into the night, preparing for the investigation that was about to sweep through the police department, Nathaniel couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. Change was coming, and while it wouldn't be easy, it was necessary. The trial had been a battle, but the war for true justice was just beginning. The news of the trial and Nathaniel's victory spread like wildfire across the country. Social media exploded with reactions, and debates raged in households, newsrooms, and public forums. For many, Nathaniel had become a symbol of resilience, a man who had used his position of power to challenge the very system he was a part of. Civil rights groups organized rallies in support of Nathaniel's cause, calling for reforms in police training, accountability, and transparency. The demand for justice was loud and clear, and the public was no longer willing to tolerate a system that perpetuated racial inequality. At one such rally, a young activist, Maya Johnson, stood on a stage before a crowd of hundreds. "What happened to Justice Nathaniel Carter is not an isolated incident," she shouted, her voice filled with passion. "Every day, black men and women are subjected to the same kind of prejudice, the same kind of abuse, simply because of the color of their skin. But thanks to Justice Carter, the world is finally paying attention. We're finally seeing the truth. And now we demand change." The crowd erupted into applause, their voices echoing through the streets. Nathaniel had sparked a movement, one that could no longer be ignored. Back at the police department, the internal investigation into Muldoon and Grayson's actions was underway. Files were being pulled, records scrutinized, and every arrest they had made was being re-examined. The inquiry was thorough, and it wasn't long before more instances of misconduct began to surface. Muldoon, once confident in his untouchable status, now found himself the subject of intense scrutiny. As more officers came forward with stories of his abuse of power, it became clear that this was not an isolated incident. Grayson, too, was implicated, though his role as a follower rather than a leader of the misconduct earned him a lesser sentence in the court of public opinion. The inquiry had begun, and it moved swiftly. What had started as a singular case involving the wrongful arrest of Justice Nathaniel Carter had snowballed into a full-scale investigation that reached the core of the police department. The aftermath of Nathaniel's courtroom victory was much more than the downfall of two corrupt officers. It was a reckoning with the system that had allowed such behavior to thrive unchecked. Nathaniel, though triumphant in his personal case, knew that this was only the beginning. He had witnessed enough to understand that the rot went deeper than just Officer James Muldoon and Officer Alex Grayson. As the inquiries unfolded, it became clear that Muldoon's aggressive style of policing had been not only ignored, but in some cases, encouraged by his superiors. Now Nathaniel was determined to expose that complicity. Muldoon's arrogance had shattered, leaving behind only a man desperately clinging to the remnants of a crumbling career. He had underestimated the consequences of his actions, and now every past misstep was being scrutinized by the very people he had once considered allies. Sitting in a stark room during one of the hearings, Muldoon felt the eyes of Internal Affairs investigator Daniels boring into him, the stack of complaints and misconduct files growing higher by the hour. Muldoon had been stripped of his badge, suspended from duty, and now faced legal action that could ruin him permanently. "Do you understand the gravity of what's happening here, Muldoon?" Daniels asked, his tone sharp and unrelenting. "This isn't just about one bad arrest. We've uncovered years of misconduct under your watch, fabricated charges, racially motivated stops, and abuse of power. It's all coming out now." Muldoon shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his bravado long gone. "I was just doing my job," he muttered, though even he didn't believe it anymore. His words sounded hollow, devoid of the confidence he once wielded so freely. Daniels shook his head. Your job was to uphold the law, not to twist it to suit your prejudices." Every arrest you made is being re-examined. And let me tell you, the evidence against you is overwhelming. Uh, Muldoon's chest tightened as Daniels continued. He had always seen himself as untouchable, but now, with every file Daniels flipped through, he realized just how far he had fallen. And this time, there was no one left to shield him from the consequences. Meanwhile, Officer Alex Grayson was facing his own reckoning. Unlike Muldoon, Grayson had never been the aggressor. He had followed orders, yes, but that was the problem. He had followed blindly, without questioning the rightness of those orders. Now, sitting in front of Lieutenant Marcus, he felt the weight of every bad decision pressing down on him. Marcus regarded Grayson with a mix of disappointment and pity. "You had a choice, Grayson," Marcus said. "You didn't have to follow Muldoon. You could have stood up, done the right thing." "Whoa!" Grayson looked down at his hands, his knuckles white from gripping the edge of the table. "I didn't realize how bad it was," he admitted softly. "Muldoon, he was always in control. I didn't want to rock the boat. But now you see where that got you," Marcus interrupted, his voice firm. "This isn't just about Muldoon's downfall. You were complicit in this. By staying silent, by going along with everything, you helped create the very environment that allowed this to happen." Grayson's heart sank. He knew Marcus was right. He had been too afraid to speak up, too worried about the consequences of going against the system. And now he was paying the price for his silence. "The inquiry is going to look into your actions as well," Marcus said. "And I'll be honest, it doesn't look good for you. But the fact that you're admitting your role in this, owning up to it, might help." Grayson nodded, though the weight of guilt still pressed heavily on him. He had hoped for a way out, but he knew there was no escaping the consequences of his choices. The best he could do now was cooperate fully and hope for leniency. Outside the courtroom and precinct, the media had latched onto the story of Justice Nathaniel Carter's wrongful arrest and the investigation that followed. It had become a national spectacle, a flashpoint for larger conversations about police brutality, racial profiling, and the systemic flaws within law enforcement. Nathaniel watched the news unfold from his office, his face expressionless as report after report highlighted the misconduct being unearthed. The story had grown far beyond his own experience, and while he was glad that attention was being drawn to these issues, he knew that media coverage wasn't enough. Real change would require action, legislation, accountability, and a complete overhaul of how law enforcement operated. Laura, his assistant, entered the room, her expression a mix of relief and anticipation. "It's spreading," she said, handing him a report. "Civil rights groups are mobilizing. They're using your case as a catalyst to demand police reform across the country." Nathaniel nodded, scanning the report. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice thoughtful. "The public is paying attention now, but we need to make sure this moment leads to real, lasting change." Laura sat down across from him, her eyes studying his face. "What's our next move?" Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "We need to keep the pressure on the system. I want to meet with lawmakers, civil rights leaders, and the police reform commissions. This can't just be about taking down a few bad officers. We need to address the systemic issues that allowed them to operate with impunity." Laura nodded. "We'll set up meetings. But Nathaniel, this fight, it's going to be long. You know that, right?" Nathaniel smiled faintly, a calm resolve in his eyes. "I've spent my entire career fighting for justice. I'm not stopping now." As the weeks passed, the investigation into Muldoon and Grayson expanded to include multiple officers within their precinct, exposing a web of corruption, misconduct, and racially biased policing practices that went far deeper than anyone had initially suspected. This was no longer a singular case. It was a systemic failure. Nathaniel's case became a rallying point for civil rights groups, who organized protests, town hall meetings, and forums to discuss police reform. Politicians were now being pressured to take action, with several cities announcing plans to reevaluate their policing practices and implement new policies aimed at preventing racial profiling and holding officers accountable for misconduct. At one such town hall meeting, Maya Johnson, the young activist who had been inspired by Nathaniel's case, stood before a packed audience. Her voice was powerful, filled with the passion of someone who had experienced injustice firsthand. "We're not just here to talk about what happened to Justice Carter," she said, her words echoing through the hall. "We're here to talk about what happens to black men and women every single day in this country. We're here to demand change, not just in one police department, but in every police department across the nation." The crowd erupted in applause, the energy in the room palpable. Nathaniel, who had been invited to speak at the event, watched from the side, his heart swelling with pride. This was why he had stayed silent that night. This was why he had allowed the situation to unfold the way it had. His personal experience had sparked a movement, one that could no longer be ignored. When it was his turn to speak, Nathaniel stepped up to the podium, the room falling silent in anticipation. His voice was steady but filled with conviction as he addressed the crowd. "I stood silent on the night I was arrested because I knew that the truth would come out in time," he began, his eyes scanning the room. "I knew that what happened to me wasn't just about one bad arrest. It was about the broken system that allowed it to happen." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But now we're in a moment where we can make real change. We're in a moment where we can demand accountability, not just for the officers who committed these injustices, but for the entire system that allowed them to thrive. We need reform, we need transparency, and we need justice, not just for me, but for everyone who has ever been wrongfully targeted because of the color of their skin." The room erupted into applause once more, and Nathaniel knew that the fight for justice was far from over. But for the first time in a long time he felt hope. Hope that change was possible, that the voices demanding reform were being heard. Back at the precinct, the internal investigation reached its conclusion. Muldoon and Grayson, along with several other officers implicated in the misconduct, were formally charged with abuse of power, racial profiling, and misconduct in public office. The inquiry had uncovered years of corruption, and the department's leadership was forced to make sweeping changes to avoid further scrutiny. Muldoon's once promising career was over, and he now faced the possibility of jail time for his actions. Grayson, while less culpable, was still held accountable for his role in enabling Muldoon's behavior and was stripped of his badge. The department, in an effort to rebuild public trust, announced a series of reforms, including mandatory bias training, the establishment of a civilian oversight board, and stricter guidelines for police conduct. But for Nathaniel, the real victory lay not in the downfall of these officers, but in the movement that had been sparked. His case had exposed the flaws in the system, and now real change was beginning to take shape. As he walked out of the courthouse, his head held high, Nathaniel knew that the fight for justice would continue. But with each step forward, he was reminded that even in the face of adversity, the power to make a difference was always within reach. The days following the inquiry were a whirlwind of public reactions, internal departmental shifts, and the slow realization that real change had taken root. For Justice Nathaniel Carter, the fight had always been about more than just clearing his name. It was about exposing the systemic flaws and ensuring that the corrupt practices that had wrongfully put him in handcuffs would no longer go unchecked. However, the victory had not come without personal cost. Nathaniel had endured the humiliation of arrest, the crushing weight of a broken system bearing down on him, all while maintaining his silence. But that silence had been strategic. He had chosen to hold back, to watch the system reveal its own failings before striking back with the truth that shattered the arrogance of those who thought themselves untouchable. Nathaniel sat in his office one evening, looking out over the city skyline as the sun dipped below the horizon. The orange and pink hues of dusk bathed his office in a warm glow, but his thoughts were far from peaceful. The journey had been long, and though the immediate battle was over, he knew the war for justice would never truly end. Laura entered quietly, a file in her hand. "Nathaniel, the final report on the inquiry just came in," she said, her tone calm, but with an undertone of pride. Nathaniel nodded, motioning for her to set the file on his desk. "How bad was it for Muldoon?" Laura sat down across from him, exhaling slowly. Muldoon's career is finished. He's facing multiple charges, including falsifying reports and abuse of power. He could be looking at serious prison time. Nathaniel didn't react at first, his fingers tapping lightly on the armrest of his chair. And Grayson? He asked after a moment. Grayson cooperated with the investigation, but his role as Muldoon's accomplice can't be ignored. He's been dismissed from the force and stripped of his badge, but he won't face jail time. There's still a part of the public that sympathizes with him, but the inquiry made it clear that silence in the face of injustice is just as damaging. Nathaniel nodded thoughtfully. He had always seen Grayson as more of a follower than a leader, swept up in Muldoon's toxic influence. But that didn't absolve him. Complicity in injustice, even in silence, was still culpability. Laura shifted in her seat, a small smile playing on her lips. You should know that your case has sparked more than just this inquiry. Several cities are announcing police reforms. You've started something bigger than any of us expected. Nathaniel looked up at her, his gaze softening. That was always the goal. The individual consequences for Muldoon and Grayson matter, but the larger change is what I've been fighting for. This can't just be about one case. It has to be about a system that no longer tolerates this kind of behavior. Wow. Laura's smile widened, and she stood, gathering her things. You're not just winning battles, Nathaniel. You're changing the war. In a dimly lit interrogation room, James Muldoon sat slumped in a chair, his face gaunt and hollow. The man who had once strutted through the precinct, confident in his untouchability, now looked like a shell of himself. Across from him sat his lawyer, furiously scribbling notes as prosecutor Marissa Quinn laid out the final charges. You're facing up to 10 years in prison, Muldoon, Quinn said, her voice calm but merciless. We've got you on false arrests, falsified reports, racial profiling, and abuse of power. You've been at this for a long time, and now it's all catching up with you. Muldoon's hands gripped the edges of the table, his knuckles white. I was doing my job, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Quinn raised an eyebrow. Your job? Your job was to serve and protect, but all you did was serve yourself. You preyed on vulnerable people, and now you're going to pay for it. Muldoon's lawyer leaned forward. My client has cooperated fully with the investigation. Surely there's some leniency to be had here? Quinn's expression didn't change. Leniency? You're asking for leniency after years of systemic abuse? We're prepared to offer a plea deal, but it's not going to save him from prison. The room fell into silence as the weight of her words sank in. Muldoon, once proud and arrogant, now faced the stark reality of his downfall. His life as a law enforcement officer was over, and his future held nothing but uncertainty and the looming specter of a prison sentence. For the first time since his arrest, Muldoon looked truly defeated. His reign of unchecked power had come to an end, and there was no escaping the consequences of his actions. Outside the walls of the courthouse, the ripple effect of Nathaniel's victory continued to spread. Across the country, activists, community leaders, and lawmakers were taking action. Nathaniel had become a symbol of resilience in the face of injustice, and his case had lit a fire that could no longer be extinguished. Maya Johnson, the young activist who had spoken out at rallies, had become one of the leading voices in the movement for police reform. She had taken up the mantle, organizing protests, drafting petitions, and holding town hall meetings to demand accountability from police departments across the nation. At a rally in the heart of the city, Maya stood on a platform, her voice carrying over the crowd. What happened to Justice Nathaniel Carter isn't just a story. It's a wake-up call for every single one of us. We're not just fighting for change, we're fighting for our lives. We will no longer allow police departments to operate in the shadows, to target us because of the color of our skin. We are demanding justice. The crowd erupted into applause, their voices filled with the same fire that had been kindled by Nathaniel's case. The movement had gained momentum, and there was no stopping it now. As Maya continued to speak, Nathaniel watched from a distance, his heart swelling with pride. He hadn't sought the spotlight, but the movement that had grown from his experience was something far greater than himself. He had sparked a fire, and now that fire was spreading. Weeks later, Nathaniel sat in a quiet room with a group of lawmakers and civil rights leaders, discussing the next steps for police reform. His presence carried weight, and every person at the table knew that the movement they were working on was being watched by the entire country. Transparency, Nathaniel said, his voice steady. That's the key. We need to make sure that every police department in the country is held accountable. No more hiding behind closed doors, no more unchecked power. Officers like Muldoon operated for so long because the system protected them. That has to change. One of the lawmakers, Senator Clark, nodded. We're drafting new legislation that will mandate body cameras for all officers and create independent civilian review boards to oversee cases of misconduct. We're also working on a national database of officers with records of abuse to ensure they can't just move to a different precinct and continue their behavior. Oh, Nathaniel leaned forward, his eyes sharp. That's a good start, but we need to make sure these measures are enforced. It's not enough to pass laws. We need to hold people accountable when they break them. The room was filled with agreement, and as the meeting went on, Nathaniel couldn't help but feel a sense of optimism. The fight was far from over, but real progress was being made. The system that had allowed officers like Muldoon to thrive was being dismantled, piece by piece. As Nathaniel left the meeting and walked through the streets of the city, he felt the weight of everything that had happened. His wrongful arrest had been a catalyst for change, but it had also been a deeply personal journey. A journey that had tested his resolve, his patience, and his belief in the system he had spent his life upholding. He knew that the fight for justice was never truly over, but for the first time in a long while, he felt that change was not only possible, it was inevitable. The voices of those demanding reform had grown too loud to be ignored, and the system itself was finally being forced to reckon with its own failings. Nathaniel stopped at the edge of a park, watching as people moved about their lives, unaware of the silent battles being fought behind the scenes. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the breeze on his face, and allowed himself a moment of peace. The war for justice would continue, but for now he could rest, knowing that he had made a difference. And that was enough. In the aftermath of Justice Nathaniel Carter's victory, the world seemed to change slowly, yet steadily, like a tide that could no longer be held back. His case had been more than just a battle in court. It had been a spark, igniting a flame that was now spreading across cities, states, and even countries. The demand for reform, justice, and equality was no longer just a voice in the crowd. It was a roar that echoed in every corner of society. But as with all movements, the fight was far from over. Officer Alex Grayson sat in a small coffee shop across from his lawyer, staring down at the cup in his hands. His dismissal from the force had been swift, and although he had avoided jail time, the stain on his career and his conscience was permanent. His family had distanced themselves, his friends had stopped calling, and he had become a pariah in his own community. The guilt weighed heavily on him, and the memory of that night, the night he had followed Muldoon into making the worst decision of his life, haunted him daily. "I can't keep living like this," Grayson murmured, his voice thick with regret. "I know what I did was wrong, but how do I make it right?" His lawyer, a quiet man named Robert, leaned back in his chair, studying Grayson with a sympathetic gaze. "There are ways to rebuild, Alex, but it's not going to be easy. You have to own up to everything, publicly. And not just the part you played in Justice Carter's arrest, but the other incidents, the patterns of silence. You need to come clean." Grayson flinched at the suggestion. He had already been through the inquiry, had already lost everything. But deep down, he knew Robert was right. The only way forward was to confront the truth, no matter how painful. "Will it make a difference?" Grayson asked, his eyes hollow. "It will," Robert said firmly, "but it has to come from you. You need to speak out, not just to save yourself, but to help others who've been wronged by the system. You owe it to them and to yourself." Grayson nodded slowly, his mind racing. He had spent his life following orders, never questioning the status quo, but now he saw that silence had been his greatest sin. It was time to break that silence. Nathaniel stood before a small group of law students at an intimate conference hosted by his alma mater. The room was packed, the air thick with the weight of their anticipation. They knew they were in the presence of a man who had become a symbol of justice, a man who had taken on a system and won. But as Nathaniel began to speak, he made it clear that his victory was not just about the courtroom. "It's easy to see the headlines and think that justice has been served," Nathaniel said, his voice calm but filled with purpose. "But real justice isn't about one case, one verdict. It's about what happens after. It's about what we do with the lessons we've learned." The students leaned forward, hanging on his every word. Nathaniel had been where they were, idealistic, driven, eager to make a difference. But he also knew that the fight for justice was not as clean or as swift as they might believe. "The law is a tool," Nathaniel continued, pacing the room. "But it's also a weapon. It can be used to build or to destroy. Our job is to make sure it's used to build something better, something more just. And that requires more than just winning in court. It requires changing hearts and minds, holding people accountable, and making sure the system we uphold is one that serves everyone equally." A hand went up in the back of the room, and a young woman stood to ask her question. "Justice Carter, after everything you've been through, what keeps you going? What makes you believe that the system can actually change?" Nathaniel paused, considering her question. The weight of his journey sat heavy on his shoulders, but there was also hope. Hope that had kept him fighting through the darkest moments. "I keep going because I've seen change, even if it's slow," he replied. "And because I know that if we don't keep pushing, then the people who come after us won't have a chance. The system can change, but only if we force it to. Only if we hold it accountable, day after day, year after year." The room fell silent, his words hanging in the air. And in that silence, Nathaniel saw the future. A generation of lawyers, activists, and leaders ready to carry the torch forward. 2 weeks later, Grayson stood in front of a press conference, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the podium. The media had shown up in droves, curious to hear what the former officer had to say. His dismissal had been public, and his role in Nathaniel's arrest had been scrutinized at length. But now, Grayson was ready to tell his side of the story. Not to excuse himself, but to confess. "I've come here today to address what happened the night of Justice Carter's arrest," Grayson began, his voice shaky but gaining strength with every word. "And to take responsibility for my actions as well as my inaction. I allowed myself to be part of a system that thrives on silence, on looking the other way. And for that, I'm deeply sorry." The cameras clicked furiously as Grayson continued, his voice growing more confident. "I was complicit in a culture of misconduct that let officers like Muldoon operate without consequence. I didn't speak up when I should have, and that silence is something I will have to live with for the rest of my life. But today, I want to break that silence. I want to make it clear that what happened that night was wrong, and it's part of a larger problem. One that we must confront if we're ever going to change the way policing is done in this country." His confession, raw and honest, struck a chord with many who watched. While Grayson had been a part of the problem, his willingness to step forward and speak out set him apart from others who had refused to acknowledge their roles in perpetuating injustice. As he finished his statement, Grayson looked out at the crowd, unsure of what would come next. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace, knowing that he had finally done the right thing. Months later, the impact of Nathaniel's case was still being felt. Across the country, police departments were implementing reforms, some small, others sweeping. Body cameras became mandatory in several states. Civilian oversight boards were established, and training programs were revamped to focus on de-escalation and bias reduction. But the true legacy of Nathaniel's fight was not in the policies or the laws. It was in the people. Maya Johnson, the activist who had become the face of the movement for many, stood in front of yet another crowd at a rally, her voice strong and clear. We're here today because people like Justice Carter refuse to stay silent, she said, her fists raised in the air. Because people like Officer Grayson learned the hard way that silence only serves the oppressors. And because every single one of you here today knows that the fight for justice isn't over. It's just beginning. The crowd cheered, their voices a testament to the power of collective action. The movement that Nathaniel had sparked had grown beyond his own story, weaving its way into the fabric of a nation that was finally reckoning with its past. And as Nathaniel watched from the sidelines, his heart swelled with pride. This was what he had fought for. Not just justice for himself, but justice for everyone who had been wronged by a system that had too long gone unchecked. He had been silent once, but never again. Back in his office, Nathaniel sat at his desk, going over the latest draft of the police reform bill that lawmakers were preparing to present. His work was far from finished, but there was a sense of accomplishment in every page he read, knowing that change was coming. Laura entered quietly, setting a fresh cup of coffee on his desk. "You've seen the latest poll numbers?" she asked with a smile. "Public support for the reforms is higher than ever." Nathaniel nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Good. That means we're making progress." She paused, studying him for a moment. "You know, Nathaniel, you could take a break. You've done more than anyone could have expected." Nathaniel chuckled softly. "I'm not done yet, Laura. Not by a long shot." "Oh." She smiled back, shaking her head. "I figured you'd say that." As Laura left the room, Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the window where the city sprawled out before him. The work was never over, but for the first time, he felt like the world was on the right path. And as long as there were people willing to stand up and demand justice, he knew that the future held hope. Because silence, after all, was no longer an option.